loves. Okay. 30-15. We have a victory there. Excellent serve. And it's 15-all. 15-all, folks. Yes, 30-15.
Look, I know those people were playing tennis by what was said. But I was there. That was football, not tennis being played. Oh, come on. You can't have a game, set and match in a game of football. Definitely, those people were playing tennis. I know, because I was listening.
What I'm referring to here, of course, is use of sport as a comparison with different cultures or ways of life. So I'm comparing American football, say, with an African way of life, and tennis with an American way of life. So then, when we have these two ways of life, missionaries, of course, have produced dictionaries following those different ways of life. Now, dictionaries then translate between one language and another. So, for example, we can translate between American football and tennis. We can have football terms and we can have tennis terms. For example, we have a term like extra men on the rush in football. Now, what does that mean in tennis? Probably it means something like that there be a spare player. In football, we have past the 40, 45-yard line. Now, how do you communicate that in tennis? Well, I guess you have to say something like no man's land. In football, we have quarterbacks. I guess in tennis, we have the player who hangs back. In football, we have the kick is good, I guess, and in tennis, you have to say the hit is good because, of course, you're not kicking the ball. So similarly, in football, you can say he throws it. So because we don't throw the ball in tennis, except when you're releasing it, in order to hit it with your racket, you'd have to say ball release. Now, in football, we have the sideline, which I guess would be the alley in tennis. Now, what I hope you are perceiving is that this dictionary actually is a bit of a deception, because the things that we are translating between are so different, because actually they're rooted in very different games. So a dictionary between, say, an African language and English can be that kind of deception, because actually what's being translated between are things that are so vastly different. So sometimes the translation may even be, we could say, meaningless. So what I want to consider now is how we can then learn how an African person functions, and particularly, as we're concerned with missiology and theology, how an African theology is devised. Now, of course, it's rooted in Christian terms in the Bible. I want to look at other ways in which one can detect the indigenous side of African theologies. So what I have here is a trainee pastor. So I'm assuming that this pastor is coming from Africa to the USA. This is a person who I'm reckoning a lot of American professors learn from. They have an African, come visit them in America. They're in the university, they participate in the courses, and they expect certain inputs from them. So we're asking ourselves, how does this person acquire these insights in the first place? Now, one place he acquires them, of course, is from his mother, implying that if you want to learn about this trainee pastor's theology, you need to be able to listen into the conversations that he has with his mother in the context in which he finds himself with his mother. The person, of course, also engages with the chief. So when he's talking with the chief and engaging with the chief on certain community issues that pertain to members of his community, what's he saying it, how is he saying it, what are the issues he's responding to? And of course, not only that text, but what's the context in which he's responding to those issues? Perhaps there are other people in the room. What has happened in the village or in the town that is having him respond in particular ways to issues that the chief is bringing to him? How does he engage with his daughter? Now, he may say, for example, I very much love my daughter, and one would hope he would say that. The question I would ask is, well, how is that love expressed? Because if someone from Africa says he very much loves his daughter, then we would be inclined as Americans to assume that he therefore loves his daughter in the way we love our daughters. In order to discern the nature of parental love, one would have to see how he relates to his daughter and how that relationship relates to the words that he uses to describe the love he has for his daughter. His wife, how does he engage with his wife? What do they say in those intimate moments when he perhaps reveals to his wife as his close friend the things that he's going through? And we could add many more. There's a village idiot. Now, perhaps this man considers him a village idiot. Perhaps other people think he's a village idiot, but this trainee pastor, when he's back in his home community, respects the village idiot. We have the bishop. How does he engage with his bishop when he talks theological matters? Yes, but how does he deal with authority? We tend up probably in the West to think when there's a bishop, there's an authority, but perhaps there isn't respect for the bishop. How is the respect for the bishop that's demonstrated? And there's so many people. His member of parliament, his son. So I think it's probably insufficient to say, to listen to how he describes his relationship with his son. We need to also discern how his description of his relationship with his son interacts with the reality of how he relates to his son as we would observe it if we were there. In other words, we have to be there to realize how his terms with which he refers to his son interacts with the reality of his relationship with them. Widows. Many pastors, of course, are concerned for widows. How does that concern for widows express itself in practice? An old man. In what respect how does he respect an old man? Does he see an old man as past the times, no longer value, or does he see him as a source of wisdom? The old man perhaps brings traditions and traditional cultures to light. How ready is he to learn from this old man about those cultures, or is that irrelevant to him because he's concentrating on biblical theology? How does he relate to a Pentecostal pastor? Let's assume that our trainee pastor is of a Reformed tradition, but perhaps he's of a Reformed tradition because the funding for study in the US was for a Reformed pastor, when deep in his heart perhaps he's more Pentecostally oriented. How does he relate to a white man? Now, we will soon discover how he relates to a white man when he's in America, but how does he relate to a white man within his own context, a missionary, say? How does he relate to his neighbor? Relationships with neighbor can be difficult. We all want to believe that we share openly and freely with our neighbors, but once you've asked to borrow something twice, perhaps you haven't given it back, or the person doesn't reciprocate, maybe asking for borrowing then comes to an end. A Muslim, a cripple. Is a cripple someone cursed by God? Not in what this person says when they're talking to us in Western theology in English, but in their interaction with them in their own community. How do they perceive a cripple? And so on and so on. Added some more here. A Catholic. How does he relate to a Catholic? Is that theology out of bounds, beyond the pale, or is it something that he's happy to look at? How does he relate to a bus driver? When he's getting on the bus, is it respectful relationship? All these things, what I'm suggesting is make up the theology of this trainee pastor when he's back in his home context. Now, events, some key events for learning about theology. Funeral, obviously, is one of them, where theology is very much put in practice. Theology is relating God with man, and that's about eternity and the transition between life and death. What is discussed at the funeral? What are the causes of death being assumed, and so forth? Again, what about on a bus? You're sitting on a bus. People are talking around you. What are they talking about? How does that relate theologically? Now, of course, on a particular occasion, they'll be saying particular things. On another occasion, they'll be saying other things. But if you make enough bus journeys, then you can get an idea of the kind of things that are discussed. We get, of course, here weddings, maybe a random meeting with somebody, how do you interact with a random visitor. Maybe a trainee pastor or potential trainee pastor is sitting there reading, whatever, and there's some women washing clothes. He's actually listening to what the women are saying as they're washing the clothes. Now, in order to know the kind of things women say when they wash their clothes that pertain to theology, we would need to also be able to overhear women as they're washing clothes. What's the interaction at mealtime? Perhaps nothing is said. That may itself be of consequence. What about the discussion in the kitchen, which he may not be privy to, but perhaps his wife reports later what was said in the kitchen, and that can, in consequential ways, affect our trainee pastor's theology. School, market, all these contexts are contexts in which the engagement of the people has theological ramifications. Okay, well, let's look now at the communication of that, let's say, holistic theological understanding to those of us who are in the West. So here's our trainee pastor, and on the right-hand side here, I have a list of the kinds of things that the trainee pastor may be communicating with us. So we have, for example, options here like you may have a discussion with this trainee pastor, he might write an article, he might give a lecture, you might just engage with them in a conversation. And in the course of the conversation, theologically pertinent things will come up. You may write a book, may be interviewed, produce a flyer, or even in the course of some kind of engagement, the person may cough at a particular place to indicate something about his theological understanding. Now, there's an issue here. We want to look at barriers of this, to this happening, or to filters. So one filter we need to be concerned about, I think, is language. So our trainee pastor, in his theological engagement in his home context, uses a particular language. Now, we are listening to him in another language. Now, typically that would be English. So what I'm suggesting is that that language will filter the content of the theology. Examples of ways in which English filters things out. There, of course, there are many examples. Often difficult to grasp by people only familiar with English as a language and an English tradition as a way of life, because often we're, like in the sports example, looking at a different connection between a language according to the context. For example, number one, on time in Africa may be better translated as late using English. So the way you in an African language say on time or punctual is nevertheless in English terms going to be late. So translating on time into English will conceal the late coming happening on the ground. Now, second example, translating he's been healed into English can be misleading, as healing in Africa tends to refer to an overcoming of a witch rather than a symptomatic change. So if we say to someone in English, translating from Africa, he's been healed, we assume there's a symptomatic change. There's a biological alteration that's happened in the person's favor, but that may not be the case in Africa at all. In African context, someone saying he wore shoes might, in English, be understood as protection for his feet, whereas the intention in Africa might have been to suggest that the person was wealthy. They prayed all night. In many English Christian circles, implies that quiet prayers are offered by one after another, sitting in a circle. Whereas in Africa, this may include like boisterous singing, loud preaching, laying on of hands, healing, and so on, all under the general heading of they prayed all night. Second, we have education. Our trainee pastor has gone through Western education, probably in English from primary school, at least supposedly, it's based on Western education, and he's been told certain things are right and certain things are wrong, certain things should be said and certain things shouldn't, which is other than the common practice in its community. We have PC, political correctness. Now, on coming to America, chances are that our trainee pastors will be told something like, don't say that. Oh, do say this. Do say that in this way, don't say it in that way. Political correct ways of speaking that are in the USA considered to be not offensive. Donors, of course, want to make sure, assuming, as is likely to be the case, this person's been sponsored by somebody, that what he says and how he communicates is in line with their own requirements. Certain things must not be said, certain things must be communicated. So the donors will again influence, filter, block parts of theological communication. Now, having looked at that example between vastly different contexts, this is not to imply that miscommunication also doesn't happen also between people in the same context, between yourself and your wife. But yet what I'm saying is that between vastly different contexts, this is particularly accentuated. So on the left here, you have these red horizontal lines represent kind of a holistic theology held by our African trainee pastor as a member of his indigenous community. Then we have the arrows showing what happens when this theology passes through these different filters in order to get to us who are receiving, participating in this discussion, reading this article, listening to the lecture, and so on. Now we have the one instance here, for example, where a certain indigenous theological understanding does not get through the educational gap. Maybe there's some rationality he's been taught in education. He realizes that this particular aspect of indigenous theology will not be appreciated in the West who believe in educational rationality. Now this goes, of course, all the way down. So a great deal I've indicated here is blocked by language because the English language will not enable him to articulate those indigenous aspects of his life which he'll be communicating within his own village. Now we have another instance here where something is not politically correct. So that comes to a halt there, and we have something that the donor would not be happy with. So only a certain amount of that which English can communicate about the traditional culture will reach us, an American professor seeking to learn about Africa through his trainee pastor from Africa. Now, of course, what also happens is that these are not only filters that block information from passing, but they also generate information. So our trainee pastor will have learned certain things in the course of his education, which he now sees is right for him to include in his description of his theology. These are the yellow lines you can see there. Certain things, you read indicated, he's told to say so as to be politically correct. And then finally, of course, the donors will say, please make it clear that this is what you're doing. Please make sure that you follow this reformed theology because otherwise people will wonder why we're sponsoring you to be here. So what you can see on the right-hand side here is something, a combination of inputs that's very different from the way in which this pastor was brought up within their indigenous context. A mixture of something that is kind of genuinely indigenous, things that have come from English, things that have come from education, things that have come that are politically correct, and things that have come from the donor. So now, in order to understand the original, what do we have to do? Well, we have to do away with some of these filters in order to be able to correctly comprehend the original that's being said. So in this case, we're doing away with the language, but in the translation, that's a key thing. But let's start by looking at the donor. So can we have a missionary who is enabled to listen to the African person, who does not have to be wary about pleasing the donor and their requirements. Secondly, political correctness. In order to realize what is actually going on in indigenous African context, we need to be able to learn and then communicate in a way that is not being guided by political correctness in the West. Because clearly, if we're guided by political correctness in the West, then we're not going to be accurate to the indigenous context in Africa. Thirdly, education. Now, this is a sensitive one. We can't deny the education that we have. I think I've been for many years going through a selective appropriation of education. Western education is built in certain assumptions that make little sense in Africa and certainly will make little sense of Africa. Positivism, for example, is foundational to much that goes on in education. So the person who wants to grasp what's actually going on in African theology needs to be able to realize the education content of his own thinking that is inappropriate and put it aside. And here finally the language, which perhaps should have been at the beginning, in order to grasp how a person is communicating theologically, to derive the theological truths from them. Of course, we need to be listening in their own language and not in a foreign language such as English. So we can say then, if I call this person a vulnerable missionary or scholar, this person who has by these means identified closely with the African and learned as the African learns, including the women washing the dishes, including the discussion in the kitchen, and so on and so forth, they are then able to communicate this content to the folks in the West. I guess you can say here we have an alternative to the African doing the communicating. But I think there's also more to say than it's an alternative. In other words, this vulnerable scholar is someone who is rooted and grounded in the West, and therefore has the advantage over the African of realizing how things are going to be received in the West. And I think this is critical. Translation should be into the unknown, into the known, right? Translation should be into the known. The person translating what is happening in Africa, for those of us in America, should be translating into the known in order for learners within America, who are Americans, to be able to learn from the known to the unknown. This means that the translator of Africa to the West should be a Westerner. It follows, of course, and this is also very consequential, that the translator explaining the West to Africa should be an African. So education in Africa should be designed and guided by Africans, and it should be presented in an indigenous language, as also our knowledge of Africa that one of our people should be acquiring through his hearing an indigenous language in Africa should be presented to us in a Western language. So just to add, before we then ask for comments and discussion, what I'm suggesting is that we have a lot of our listening is misguided in the sense that we can only listen to a person when they've already gone through these screens. Now there's two ways, it's simplifying, to listen to an indigenous African person. One is to push them through the screens, language, education, and so on, so that they can communicate to us when we're in the West. The other is for us to get through the screens to reach the person where they are, and then having done that, for us, whoever this individual is or people are, to communicate that back to the West. Now when he's communicating, assuming he's a he, to the West, our trainee pastor is communicating into the unknown. They're coming from the known into the unknown, Whereas I suggest what we actually need to be looking at is someone who's coming from the unknown into the known. So an American, a Brit, whatever, going into Africa and communicating back into the West is communicating the unknown in Africa into the known in the West. That, to me, is the way that translation ought to be, must be. So it just seems to me that there is a great deal of learning going on and building up of a body of knowledge which we interact with missiologically that is in these ways too far flawed to work with. The very existence of that body of knowledge then, of course, can delegitimize the person who is going the other way around, say the American living in African context, who is communicating to the known, may well be told, no, you're wrong, because the African themselves have said it like this, not realizing that the African has said it like this for a multitude of reasons that are have relatively little to do with what's actually happening on the ground in their own community. Now, that failure to grasp context can be very crippling to our endeavors at engaging in Christian mission. There you go. I hope that's something that's prodded a few thoughts, and look forward to contributions or questions. Okay, so here's a question that was asked. Appreciation for what I'm getting across. So the person says, affirming what I'm saying. It seems a Western person can't do this kind of thing in 3 years. Yet the average missionary term these days is likely to be less than it used to be. So my question is, how long would it take a Western person to do what you're suggesting to get such a deep knowledge of context? For that question, which is a key question as well. I mean, in timescale, I think we need to talk about a minimum of 10 years. But I mean, I think this is beyond saying, look, we don't have missionaries, you do that. I think we're talking about a massive failure in love, and a massive failure in communication, and a massive misdirection of efforts arising from the failure from not doing this. It's not something like, oh, it's not practical because these days the average longevity of a missionary is just 4 years. Now remember, the missionary who does it 4 years has been informed by the system that I'm critiquing, and they're reading the books read by the Africans, or they're reading the books written by the Africans. They're reading the books written by the professors who received the training pastor into the US, and that's where they continue to get their insights. They're not drawing on the insights that have been received by the person who is on the ground, because they're already, in many ways, I think, discredited. People in the West don't want to listen to. Now, I mean, okay, I'm kind of in that position, so I've got to talk it personally. The Brit who's been in Africa 30 years, they want to listen to the African. And that is a big error. Now, that sounds horrible to say, but it is. And I've tried to explain why. This isn't something, look, we really ought to do this, but we can't. We must. If we don't, we have the power, financial power, basically, and not only the financial power, not that everyone else is poor, but other people who have financial power do not have the kind of concern that we in the West have to use that power to reach out to people in a way that we think we're doing. Let's put it that way.
This is stimulating. You've been blowing this trumpet for a long time. We missionaries don't understand, but yet we're confident that we do. Do you have any encouragement? Can you talk at all about India? Is this a parallel or a contrast with Africa?
I've never been to India. I'm not specifically familiar with the context there. I'm aware that long-term ministry in Africa can be very difficult. Now, one of the reasons I think it is very difficult is because it's very hard for someone from the West to go to India or Africa without making a splash. Our supporters require, often within months, well, what have you done? How many people have you fed? How many saved? Now, that kind of thinking forces a missionary to make splashes
but those splashes are made in ignorance. They upset people. They undercut the local power brokers and the local markets and everything else. So there's resistance to missionaries in many parts of the world. I think India much more than many parts of Africa. How to overcome that resistance? Stop missionaries making splashes. Don't give them a spending budget. Let them spend to keep themselves alive. Let them learn the language, and then after 10 years, they can start using that language in ministry without any spare money in their pocket. If we don't, then our relations will continue to be by the people received from there in the West, and we will, as Western people, be rendered more and more blind, and that blindness is dangerous.
So, do you see evidence of people hearing and responding to this? The mission machine doesn't listen very well. We know the answers, we're getting on with the job. Are there signs of our functioning with better paradigms today?
Well, I don't have my finger on the pulse of Western mission to the degree that I guess many people on this call have. Personally speaking, I mean, we had a consultation in 2005 in the UK, which had an attendance of 6, including my parents. You know, that's the level we were at. In terms of the Alliance of Vulnerable Mission, we now have an administrative structure with a group of maybe 6 very enthused people to different degrees actually engaging in mission on this basis and supporting mission on this basis, perhaps through their historical experience and so forth. So in that sense, yes, a growing trend. Now, I'm not saying it's easy, but I am saying it's critical. And I've tried to illustrate that with the slides in order to help people to realize there's another game being played and we're unfamiliar with it while funding what we think is a game being played. So it is that gross. And I mean, what can you do? You can take the horse to water, and I'm saying the horse needs to get to the water and it needs to drink. How do we guide our young people? How do we speak at the universities? There's the glamour of, I mean, I think that's what draws people, the glamour of mission, you know, going to foreign parts, walk around in the jungle and the natives come and talk to you. They even know English, you know, you can talk to them. But that can be missing so much what's going on.
So then what are your thoughts regarding disciple-making movements? They emphasize speed. As I listen to you, what of DMM, disciple-making movements? What do you think of that as a methodology?
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I've delved into that a little bit when the EMQ had some discussions on it and so forth. I think you'd be right to guess that it's hard to be very enthusiastic about it. Now, in a sense, I think it's, let's say, let it continue. What I'm saying is, can there also be people who don't follow that methodology and do mission, you know, in flesh and blood in a vulnerable way on the ground for an extended period? And maybe then we need to listen to those people about what they're actually saying about the disciple-making movements. Because if I say, well, no, disciple-making movements aren't helpful, then there are a lot of folks maybe in this circle who are very, very well studied on disciple-making movements and looked at them in great detail and drawn their own conclusions. Now, the one, I've forgotten the author now, I read the one book and reviewed it, and I thought he was right to powerfully critique them. In terms of the local context, I can say that in order to find people who are doing something genuine, in other words, indigenous people, that is pushing me more and more towards what we call the indigenous churches, which are rather replete in my area. These are churches who we would in many ways say are very wrong in their teaching. They stay close to their pleasing of the ancestors, and they're very active in very overt ways against witchcraft. But at least they're honest. they're coming from their hearts and they're expressing in their hearts and they're using a language in the way that makes sense to them. As soon as you move out of those circles into anything that starts to get Western funded, Western founded, then you get this level of that I've talked about of whatever it is. I mean, I don't want to use a negative term, but people are concerned about the money, the prestige, they want English, they want to get an education. I mean, just by way of an example, I was recently right down in the south of Tanzania. I spent 2 weeks teaching a diploma course. Now, I don't do that frequently, but I enjoy that formal teaching. At the end of the 2 weeks of teaching, the principal spent half an hour working on me. We need you to teach English. What you might have taught in Swahili or not is irrelevant. We need English. English is the way forward. We must have English. Now, that to me said something about the fact that the theological insights that I was seeking to impart, and that in the course of a diploma we tried to give to the African students, the local principal who knows what's going on in people's hearts, knows their want and desire for money, was prepared to shelve that and say our diploma should be the means for our students to learn English, because it must be taught in English. At the end of the whatever years of diploma, the main benefit they'll have is they'll know English, and then they can move outside the country. Tanzania obviously uses a lot of Swahili, and draw interested people, donors and so forth to us. So our clever theology doesn't cut much mustard. Now, what does? I mean, that's not a question that's easy to answer, partly because that which cuts the mustard is not easily comprehensible in Western English.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed that presentation. It reminded me of Don Smith's work. He said, make haste slowly. He talks of communications theory and says that non-verbal communication is most influential. What do you think of Don Smith's work?
Right, thank you for that. Now, one thing that comes to mind, and this is something I struggle with when I go to these indigenous churches, sometimes the words they say are very wonderful, kind of straight out of Calvin or whatever. They present these wonderful Christian truths, and then moments later, there's a woman becomes possessed in their midst, and everyone is now attentive to what she's going to say, because these words from the ancestors is what's going to give them the orientation that will bring success in their lives. Now that cuts with my own original theology, if you like, word-based, share the word. And once we share these profound truths that to us are so deep and meaningful, unfortunately, to me, it doesn't mean they necessarily cut very deeply amongst the indigenous people. So the actions there, a case of possession can be very dramatic. People can be very attentive. Now the words coming from the ancestor are taken as consequential because of the way they're presented, I suppose. Now the actions of, let's say, for example, the humility, or in a sense, death. I think the role of a missionary is to die, and the actions of a dying missionary cannot help but speak. What's this fool doing here? The words are more difficult. I mean, typically, in my case, if I'm using indigenous language, preaching to indigenous people, if you like, the person who then takes over says, well, Jim's always hard to understand, but I hope you got something. It's not a very encouraging message they're giving very often, Now, when their own person stands up and speaks, you can just see the attentiveness in the people. Now, that may be my own failings. I mean, I'm not a great evangelist. So if there were people who are more gifted, say, at preaching evangelism, maybe they'd do better, but I don't see them. Those who might be around, I'm not familiar with anyone, even in Tanzania, who does serious evangelism using Swahili, Mzungu, white person. They're not there. Now, if you set up your big PA system and have a crusade out of doors, then people see the power and they come and they'll fall down when you speak. But to actually touch people's hearts, with your words, yes, it's difficult. So your life has to be part of it.
Yeah, another question. Many of us here have lived in other cultures. We have 25% of the culture, then we meet with the diaspora who know 25% of ours. Then we are in the dance. So the question is, whose rules do we follow? Will they defer to me or me to them? Question, how should we engage with such people?
I mean, I started years ago imagining myself, say, coming back to live in London. And in London, you have people from all around the world, including people of the tribe I work with here. So I thought, okay, if I have to go back to London, will I be the right person to connect with that tribe in London? And I say, well, when I'm in Kenya, I'm trying to encourage them to do their own thing, using their own language, to be self-sufficient and to think their own thoughts. But that's facing the wrong direction when you're in London, because everybody else who's compassionate for these outsiders will be saying, well, here's government money, here's English classes, here's how you get the benefits. You must get your kids into school on time. Don't practice female circumcision, whatever it is. So I've not implemented this. I was in London for a few years after 4 years in Africa. Now, as many years, decades later. But I don't think it would work. I think within the West, to try to hold people to their own culture, to me, if as a theoretical topic, if you like, in a sense, they wouldn't appreciate. That's my view. Or it'd be, now, not detracting from what you're doing. This is just my view. And it's kind of be difficult, I think, also if I was doing this and then a fellow Brit showed up. I mean, I would be communicating wrong things to them, behaving perhaps in the wrong way, I think, embarrassing, blah, blah, blah. Now, this then to me brings me to what I think is a absolutely critical theme, and it's also a vastly sensitive topic, because a very powerful ideology guiding us in the West is that of anti-racism. And anti-racism says treat everyone, this is how I understand it, as if they're a secular Westerner. And if you kind of assume that someone falls short of that Western secular standard, then you're quickly taken as racist. Well, everyone here falls short of that standard. But when they get to the West, you're not allowed to say it anymore. And then again, that contributes to the way in which people don't want to hear how, say, African people appear to a Westerner in Africa. They want to know how they appear to an African in Africa. I mean, we just take, for example, envy. Now, an African in Africa isn't going to come to Europe and tell us that they're very envious, because to them, their level of envy is normal. Now, perhaps a European going to Africa says, these people are just consumed by envy. So you go back to the West and say, these people are consumed by envy, you're racist. So I think I haven't been in that position, and I think if I went to UK, I wouldn't put myself in that position. I wouldn't I'd visit Africans a few times for worship, but I don't think I'd have the heart to invest myself in that cultural middle place, because I would be facing in the wrong direction.
Yeah, question here. You say don't hear from the African. Can you flesh that out, please? Please comment on what you mean by that.
I mean, one way of looking at it is to go back to the video of the tennis, the American football. Now, my problem is I'm not very familiar with American football. But if I talk about soccer, some of you will be less familiar. So you're talking about a requirement for depth in culture in order to really draw on this. If let's give a soccer example where at least I'm a little bit familiar. So in soccer, we have a throw-in. Now, the ball in your hands, two-handed, and you throw in after the ball has gone out. So if you think, well, how am I going to say that in tennis? Well, the only time you throw the ball is when you're throwing it up, because you're going to hit it with your racket. So then in your translation, you're going to say throw-in is ball release, because I think technically it's called ball release, up goes a ball and you hit it with a racket. So that degree of incommensurability in translation is, again, something that we ignore. And I hope that video just gave us a quick glimpse into it, that the discourse can be of one ilk, that can be totally different from what's happening on the ground. But then I can hardly blame those American football players if they realize that tennis is the sport that brings the money. To try and translate is just going to confuse things. So they just transplant a discourse that the tennis players want to hear. The danger is that they come and see what's happening, so you use all possible means to stop them coming to see what's happening. I mean, classic one that people have said to me, American missionaries said, the Africans don't want you to be like them. And as if that means that we shouldn't want to be like them, because the Africans don't want us to be like them. They don't see any point. They don't see the future in who they are. They want to be like us. Now, if you're going to listen to them, we don't want you to be like us. Well, then you're never going to make the effort to learn the language and be like them. But if you don't try to be like them, how are you going to understand who they are? If you don't understand who they are, how can you effectively communicate to them? Now, again, the primary role of a missionary that I'm seeing, at least today, is not communicating to the African. It's communicating about the African back to the West, because I'm very poor at communicating to the African. I just don't get it. Now, that makes me realize how little the Africans perhaps get who we are. But for me, to not communicate with the Africans doesn't have so many financial implications, because you're not watching anyway. You're not there to laugh at me. But the other way does have mega financial implications. I mean, any threat to the ability of an African person to communicate clearly to the West is dynamite, perhaps seems. But then the reason we're following that model is not because it's the right model, and it's certainly not the sacrificial model, but it's because the financial equations favor that person. We've built the system such that, I mean, those people get the positions in the seminaries in the US. And compared to African seminaries, they're well-paid positions, and they get to be respected even when they go back home. I was a professor in the US, blah, 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 and so on. It's the whole thing is built the wrong way around if you take into account the need for translating into what is familiar. So again, if you think of a tennis player and you're wanting to tell them about American football, now I think you really need to know what tennis is about before you try explaining, in order to, you hit, instead of hitting the ball with a racket, you throw it with your hands. Now, how does that make sense to a tennis player who doesn't know about American football? It doesn't make sense. You have to know tennis pretty profoundly before in order to know what to tell a tennis player in order to begin to make sense of American football. So you have to know the West pretty profoundly before you can begin to communicate what's helpful into the West. Now, of course, those African scholars who have renowned, I mean, the Ghanaian fellow who died a few years ago, and also the fellow who's there at Yale,
Lamin
Sani. Now, I mean, they deep exposure to the West, Western wives. At over tea, breakfast, whenever, they're always talking with their Western wives. And they've lived in France, they've lived in the US. Now, they're still coming in the wrong direction. But if we give them the credibility, the sad part of it is then we have to discredit our own people. What do you do? I mean, it's good to listen to the foreigner, but it's respectful to listen to a foreigner in their context. Not by pulling them into our context, but they're very happy to come into our context because we have the funds to help them to do that. I mean, if I can get my head around it right now, if I was now to have to use Luo to explain America to you in living in Kenya, is that the equivalent? I mean, it's just crazy. How can I explain how America functions using the Luo language? I can't. That's the whole point. It functions so basically differently. But yet we expect them to come to America and explain using English how Luo culture functions. It doesn't work.
Okay, so some follow-ups to that. Some will say you have an old perspective. Nowadays, people in Africa want to learn English. You need it to accommodate to them. How do you respond to the accusation that you are 100 years behind? Africa has changed. How would you respond to that?
I think that's a critique that's certainly extant. Why do Africans want to know English? Money. Why is there money attached to English? Because we put it there. Why do we put it there? there's a charitable motive and a compassionate motive. There's also a, goodness sake, I don't want to go there. That village looks dirty. Underlying it all. Fear, a laziness motive. We believe in the Christianity, we live in the US, we don't want, if they say you don't need to come to us, we come to you, we like that. That saves us from getting our feet dirty and everything else. Epistemologically, now I think it seems like I'm overdriving the point maybe, but I don't see we're heading to anything but disaster, because you can't transplant something where there's no foundation to receive it. If you take, say, the modern system, in which theologies are apart, it's a dualistic theology. We have our theology, and that connects to the secular, and we take those with us. And of course, in the early days, when the pastors were the best paid people, every African wanted to be a pastor, and now it's kind of the best paid people are the business people and so on. So you get the lower standard wanting to be a pastor and everything else. But it's still the same basic motivation. In a holistic point of view, it's a power that makes meaning. Now, if we believe that, then we just need to give them more and more food. But the whole thing becomes a massive exercise in dependence. I was just thinking today, I'm coming onto your territory, which is a dangerous thing to do, but the race issues, I think this is what underlies it. We have to assume that our secular way of looking at things is normal. And if the Africans, if it's not normal for them and they deny it, then the whole world says they're stupid. So they say, yes, we're like you, but they're not. So it's kind of grabbing someone and with their arm behind their back and twisting it till they shout in pain, because this belief is so fundamental to who we are as Western people and how we believe things ought to be. If it's not that way, we're in trouble, because we failed to get to where they are in order to be able to engage a translation process. We've left that to them, but it's an impossible process. I'm closely relating to many young people who are engaging in a lot of education. Just the other day, I had this conversation. I didn't know how to take it further. I said, well, English is a problem, not a benefit. How do you say chemical terms in an African language? Oxygen, hydrogen, where are those in our language? They're not there, so we have to use English. But then you say, well, where is chemistry in your worldview? Well, it's not there. I know the fellow. When he's in church on a Sunday, he's not interested in chemistry. He's interested in getting that spirit out of the person. But we're not connecting with that. We're making connection with that, in a sense, illegal. Because if that's who you take African people as being, then you're racist. And we missionaries prefer to listen to the African to tell us, oh, you're doing a great job. We need the education in America. And then you say, adapt it to your context, as if that is the answer to all, of all things, when you can't adapt it to the context. But they'll do it anyway because there's money in it. There's money in it because you get the scholarship, you go back to Africa, and if you know the English, you can run a business, you get all those things that are there. So that perception. Now we're the ones who, it seems to me, as talking about as a Westerner, we have to get around that. We have to, well, what's the term? I can't think of the term now. Jump ship. Get someone out there and keep them there and not undermine them because they say things different to what we would like them to say and what the Africans are saying. Because they will say things different. And clear to me, but there ain't so many people there to confirm what I'm saying. They ought to be there.
Now, how do you deal with the success stories? I mean, Africa is the success story. Africa is more Christian than America. How do you deal with that? The church is growing fast. Yet we have this massive communication failure and so on.
Yeah, I think I'd be the first to say the church in this community is everything. Now, there's very few Muslims in this area, so the church kind of is all over, the Bible's all over, and the Christianity is all over, and it's helping people, if you like, it's part of their life. Now, there's all the differences between whether you should be saved or not saved. There's all those disputes, but that doesn't detract from the fact that it's foundational to the way people are living their lives. Now, I don't think that detracts either from the point that I'm making. Now, what's not happening is a theology being built from grassroots up. I mean, if you have three kinds of churches, mission churches, Pentecostal churches, indigenous churches, then there the twain shall meet. And certainly indigenous, to many who are in the more educated, wearing Western clothes kind of category, they avoid them, they treat them with a barge pole, because it's kind of shameful to them that that's going on. They're building on the West, whether it be the Pentecostal pastor's suit or whether it be mission pastor's connections with the Anglican Church in England. That's their lifeline, and that's where they're going. So at the same time, yeah, they recognize, if I take again the example of envy, that the Bible does speak against envy, but I think you're aware, and I hit this a lot, and I'm sure you hear about it, you hear the typical pastor saying, we'll be the head and not the tail. We will become wealthy and powerful. We will succeed. That's not biblical, I don't think. Now, I don't stand up and tell them they're wrong, but it's a misunderstanding what's going on because they don't realize the roots of what we're building on in order to achieve that. So what if you suddenly pulled the Western plug on Kenya now and left the people without any outside inputs? Well, what happened? Well, I think the church would survive and it would thrive, and the Sunday service is what would thrive more than the schools and the colleges and hospitals. The Sunday services would continue. But I also think very clearly that they would become much more as what we now see as the indigenous churches. And it happens anyway, except it's kept a little bit out of sight to the Western theologians, like the issue of the demon possession. Casting out of demons is what people like in churches. But if you communicate that in the West, I think you're kind of, what's wrong with you? You need the teaching. People aren't looking for the teaching, they're looking to get rid of the demons. So the donors pull the plug and no longer support, people will, let's say, go back to that. Yeah, did they go back to that? If they go back to that, we can trust that someone might build on that, which at the moment isn't happening, because if you want theological education, like by law in much of East Africa, it has to be in English. And this applies apparently even in Tanzania, which is, throughout Swahili all over, but the formal theological education that's going to be recognized by government has to be in English. But if you do it in English, your curriculum is going to get borrowed from the West, and people are going to learn the right things to say when they meet an American. They're not going to connect with where they're at. Now, if there's a Westerner who does better than I do, and you can contribute to the indigenous without backing what you have with foreign money, you can be a part of throwing light on that. Now, I see myself as in that position and endeavoring to do that, but it's a struggle because, as someone said at the beginning, the wind is blowing the other direction, and it's hard to be taken seriously. And on the contrary, to be honest, I'm facing a lot of backlash where I'm being written off, because the dominant message is the other direction. And that's what people want to hear. But it's not profoundly Christian. I mean, the prophet, I just think about Amos, went from the southern kingdom to the northern kingdom. It appears he kind of walked by himself and got himself into trouble and was vulnerable to the people. That isn't the way we do it now. It's on the internet and so on. So I can't remember your exact question now, but I hope I've answered it.
So you described different kinds of churches. What about the new churches in Europe, African churches? They're also very concerned with demon possession. Will we learn more from them?
My own thought would be that it's much more difficult to understand when people express themselves in English, because we have this duplication of meaning now. A term that to us should mean this and to them it means that. It's very hard to to keep those two apart. It's also, to an extent, if you want to do something crazy, don't do it while mum's watching, go far away and do your crazy thing. But if you're living amongst your own people, the pull to your own people is powerful. I mean, if I take my own example, I think you're aware, I live in an African village. Now I'm engaging with Egyptians. I can go months without meeting a Brit or an American. When I do meet them, they're not part of my life and ministry. Now, it's very hard to do if you're in the US. Now, even having done that, partly, I mean, I do a lot of scholarship, which I think I have to do, and even though I do it, doesn't mean that I'm managing to keep my head very high above water, because of the pressure coming the other direction. But it remains a struggle. Now, maybe my mind is too limited, and I think that's a factor. And I do realize, I can kind of, I think, express myself in some profound ways in a group like this. Now, if I'm in the Luo community, I'm kind of the dumb boy. I don't know what to say and when to say and how to say it. And when I do say things, as I already indicated, people excuse me later. Well, Jim's hard to understand, but I hope you got something. And we like to have a white man speak. So even though I'm using the Luo language and been in Africa 35 years, that's still what I'm facing. Now, I think I do get closer to people, but it's hard to know because I don't see anyone else who I can compare with. There's a fellow in the next village who's doing the same thing, then everyone's saying, this is a wonderful preacher who brings God's word to us, but Jim isn't. Then you say, well, there's a problem with me. But where is that person? I'm not seeing him at all. Where is a white person who does serious ministry on an ongoing basis without funding themselves with foreign money, pushing themselves with foreign money in indigenous language?
So how can we get hold of your materials? Presumably through the Vulnerable Mission website.
Yeah, thanks. You can certainly trace it through the Vulnerable Mission website. If you want to go more directly, academia.edu give you option to have a personal website. I can probably send the link here. So that's where I keep what is not entirely comprehensive, but basically a comprehensive list of the writing that's been published in one form or another. Now, included there are my books. One book came out about 2 weeks ago. I've actually self-published it, basically. One major reason I self-published it because I just didn't want to take the time to try and get it through the screen of. Some of the articles have been copied, peer-reviewed, some have not. But it's a lot of effort, a lot of time sitting at the desk editing. I spend a lot of time doing that anyway. So I thought, well, I'm off the radar screen of a lot of peer reviewers. So I had helpful assistance from an editor and have put it out, perhaps not perfect. Vulnerable Mission, Listening to God and Man in Africa, I think is the title. So that's available in paperback and Kindle version, Kindle published on Amazon. Now, my other books are on Amazon. Whether I've written some or published something that follows the particular illustrations I use today, I haven't used before. Obviously, you come at the same topic from different angles, and I've looked at the issue of communication from different angles, trying to make clear how stark this issue is. I hope successfully. I mean, I don't know. And I guess a lot of people, when they look at it, they think this fellow's too way off the radar screen, because there's this convention of the mainstream, like listen to the African. Now, I mean, if I had to explain America to the Luo people in the Luo language, I think they better listen to the Luo person who is in America rather than to me, because at least he knows what the Luo are hearing. But the reverse, it doesn't apply. It should. We need to hear about the foreign from our own people who've been in the foreign in a vulnerable way. Repeating myself here.